Hi, I'm Shayla with Revolting Science Resources, and today I'm going to walk you through the Scrum for Scientists framework. Let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about the Scrum for Scientists framework. I'll talk a little about what Scrum is, walk you through the Scrum for Scientists framework from Revolting Science Resources, and then end with some frequently asked questions. Okay, so what is Scrum? So Scrum is an agile project management methodology that involves incremental actions over short periods of time with regular feedback and review. So the idea is taking a really large project, breaking it up into smaller pieces, and then getting regular feedback and review on those pieces to make sure you're heading in the right direction. So now let's walk through the Scrum for Scientists framework. So first I'll say I did not create Scrum. Scrum's been around for a long time. What I did though was adapt Scrum so that it was better suited for an academic research environment. So what I'll do now is basically just walk you through the framework pretty generally, and then I'll talk through each of these pieces much more in depth. So first you have the experiment backlog. This is essentially just a place that houses all of the different experiments that you're trying to complete for your project. Then you have the sprint backlog. This is going to be a prioritized subset of that experiment backlog, and these are going to be the things that you actually accomplish during the duration of your sprint. Then you have the sprint, which is the duration of time in which you're doing your experiments. And during that time frame, you'll also be doing weekly sprint updates. And this is going to be a time where you're just sharing with a PI or other lab members involved in the project what you did last week, what you're planning to do this week, and any barriers you encountered while you were doing your work. Then once your sprint is completed, you'll then do a sprint review, which is when you share with as many people as possible what you accomplished during your sprint, any barriers or struggles that you had while completing your sprint, and what you plan to do for the upcoming sprint. And then you also can basically take out any usable sprint results. So these are going to be completed experiments or completely analyzed data that you can pull out of your sprint and then use for other purposes like grants, publications, or presentations. So that's generally what the framework looks like. And what I'll do now is walk you through each of the different pieces of this much more in depth. So first you have that experiment backlog. Again, this is going to be a prioritized list of all of the experiments or questions that you want to answer for your larger scientific project. If you're anything like me, the thought of that sounds incredibly daunting. How are you supposed to know every single thing that you're going to need to do for a project? The reality is, for some projects, you won't. For most projects, you won't. And so what this actually can be used for instead is just keeping track of maybe roughly 6 months of work that you want to get done. So if you have enough things on your experiment backlog to basically be thinking about for your project for roughly 6 months, that's plenty. And then as you get closer to the end of a project, you can then kind of maybe flesh out much more in detail everything that needs to get done to finish that project. Another thing to note is that sometimes it can be really tricky to know every experiment that you want to complete. So another suggestion I would have is actually framing all of the things in your experiment backlog as questions that you're trying to answer with your project. And then under those questions, figuring out what experiments and analysis you would need to complete to be able to answer those questions. Then using that as your framework for the experiment backlog. Next is the sprint backlog. So the sprint backlog is going to be a prioritized subset of your larger experiment backlog. And these are going to be the things that you're aiming to complete during your sprint. There's a couple things about the sprint backlog. One is that the goal is 100% completion of all items in your sprint backlog. I'm sure that sounds incredibly daunting, and especially given that a lot of science is failure. But that's also why the definition of done in the scenario is not that the experiment worked properly or gave you the results that you expected, but it's that you just did the experiment. So if you have 3 items on your sprint backlog, the goal is to actually do the 3 experiments that you've put on your sprint backlog, even if they all return negative results or none of them work properly. So next you have the sprint itself. So the sprint is essentially a defined time frame to work on the items that are in your sprint backlog. Based off the research I did in graduate school, I'd recommend about 2 months for the duration of your sprint. But just know that you can change this time frame based off the kind of research that you do. If your experiments tend to be things that are easier for you to control, I'd recommend a shorter duration for your sprints. And if they tend to involve things that you don't have as much control over, I think about 2 months or slightly longer would be appropriate. Another thing to note is that during your sprint, you not only need to complete all of the experiment items on your sprint backlog, you also should be doing any sort of analysis or other kind of things you would need to actually interpret the results of those experiments. In some cases, that's not possible, but whenever it is, that's definitely the goal for what you're accomplishing during your sprint. Next, we have the weekly update. So in the weekly update, this is basically a time to share with your PI or other lab members that are kind of involved in the project what you accomplished the week before, what you plan to accomplish this week, and anything that you need help with or any barriers that you encountered. I would recommend that this is something that's part of a scheduled meeting that you have. If you have weekly meetings with your PI or other lab members, I think it can be a really great way to kind of structure your meetings and then also make sure that you're getting advice and information that you need to kind of make progress on your project. If you don't normally have weekly meetings, another really great way to utilize this framework is in an asynchronous kind of model where you're just sharing email updates or Slack messages with PIs or other lab members, just letting them know kind of what you've been working on and what you're planning to work on. What I think is really great about this is that it really helps kind of create alignment between PIs as well as their lab members in terms of what actually should be done this week. Even if we have our sprint backlog, which is prioritized and helps us know kind of how to structure our time, that doesn't always work the best when, a grant deadline's coming up or a conference is about to happen and we need to be working on a presentation. So making sure that you have that alignment with your PI in terms of, should I actually be doing these experiments this week? It's a really great way to frame all of those kind of questions, but then also just make sure that everyone's on the same page. Next item that I'll talk about is the sprint review. The idea with the sprint review is that essentially you're sharing what you accomplished during your sprint, and then based off of what results were able to be pulled out, any information you gained, and any barriers that you ran into, you're getting feedback from a larger group of people on how to proceed forward, and then deciding what you are going to do in the next sprint. So the goal here is to try to make the group of people that come to a sprint review as big as possible. What I'd recommend for a sprint review is some type of presentation. And then what you can do is then just basically have as many people as possible, especially people not regularly working on your project, weigh in with what they think about the work that you've been doing, any issues you've been having, and where you're planning to take it next. Having some people that aren't so closely tied to the project weigh in is a really great way too to make sure that the work that you're doing is contributing to the things that other people find really valuable or interesting about the experiments and work that you've put together so far. But also, it's a really great way to get any kind of assistance, help, and feedback from a larger group of scientists. And then the last piece of the Scrum for Scientists framework is the usable sprint results. So the usable sprint results are essentially the mostly complete experimental data that can be used for things like publications, grants, and presentations. I would recommend that as you start collecting data and analyzing it, putting those into publication ready quality as soon as possible. So making your figures look publication ready, adding captions, adding other descriptions and information, and then just building upon those as you gain more of the data that you need. I think this makes it really easy to kind of slot it into different formats. So if you are about to present at a conference, you now have kind of mostly complete publication quality data to include in your presentation. Or if there's an upcoming grant, and although you only have an N of 1 for this, it's really easy to just kind of slide that into a grant as preliminary data. So thinking about kind of as you're completing different portions of your projects, if it's possible to be able to analyze those and get them into formats that are ready to be used in other areas, and that can be a really great way to kind of distill some of the information that you're generating and some of the data that you're generating from these sprints. So that is the Scrum for Scientists framework. I'll walk through this diagram one more time, and then I'll answer some kind of frequently asked questions. So the experiment backlog is going to be where you include all of the questions or experiments that you're planning to do for your project. Then you have your sprint backlog where you've prioritized a subset of that experiment backlog that you're going to complete during your sprint. Then you have the sprint, which is the duration of time that you're actually going to be doing a lot of that work, as well as the analysis associated with that. And every week during your sprint, you're going to send updates to either your PI or other involved lab members and just let them know what you completed last week, what you plan to complete this week, and any barriers or issues that you're running into. Then once your sprint is complete, you'll then have a sprint review session, and that's where you'll basically share with as many people as possible what you completed during your sprint, any troubles or issues that you ran into, and then what you're planning to do for your next sprint. And then the last thing you'll do is pull out any usable sprint results, put those in publication ready quality, and then have those ready to be used in other formats like grant applications or presentations. So now I'll jump into a couple of frequently asked questions. So what if you finish all of the items in your sprint backlog before the sprint's done? If this happens, there's kind of two different routes that you can take. If you're the person actually doing the experiments from the sprint backlog, If you're feeling up to it, you're welcome to add some more items from that experiment backlog into your sprint. What I will say though is that the only people who should be adding items into a sprint backlog should be the person actually doing the experiments. So if you are a person who is just involved in the project, or you're the PI who's helping kind of manage multiple projects, you should not be adding any items from the experiment backlog to the sprint backlog during a sprint. That can only be done by the people actually doing the work. But if you finish early, a thing that a lot of PhD students struggle with is taking a break. That's a fantastic time to take a break. You've accomplished your goal. You can take a break, enjoy the rest of your sprint. There's probably other work that you want to complete, other things you wanted to get done, or maybe just take a little mini vacation, whatever it is. But my recommendation is that if you finish your sprint backlog early, take a break, slow down for a second. It's not so much time that you're going to be putting yourself that far behind, and there's so many other things that you have to work on. You'll find some way to fill it, I'm sure. The next question is, can I use this framework if my PI isn't on board? So yes, the short answer, yes. You might need to adapt some of what it looks like, but overall, this framework is a really great way just to structure your own time, structure your own priorities, and make sure that you're making progress on the things that you want to make progress on. A lot of the times we don't just have one project that we're doing. And so having this kind of framework applied to multiple different projects is a really great way to make sure that progress is being made on all fronts, but it's the progress that's going to drive the biggest impact in the project. If your PI isn't on board, some of the kind of suggestions of things you might want to adjust or change, maybe you don't need to send them weekly updates. Maybe these are just kind of structures that you have for the kind of cadence of meetings that you currently already have scheduled with your PI. You probably also might have a harder time getting a larger group of people together for your sprint reviews. What I would recommend for that is if you do give lab meetings, maybe asking if this can be kind of how you do lab meetings, and ask about, if there's ways to kind of incorporate that into the lab meeting schedule. If you have just a group of friends that are also scientists, ask if maybe they would be interested in kind of having sprint reviews together and have this be kind of more of a communal experience. How could I use this framework if I'm not conducting experiments? So in the Scrum for Scientists framework that I modified, I did have experiments in mind. But the beauty of Scrum is that it's used for a million different things in the field of project management, and you can use it for any work that you're trying to accomplish in your academic research. So what I would recommend changing if you're trying to use a Scrum for Scientists methodology for something other than experiments is mostly just adjusting the duration of your sprint. So instead of a 2-month time frame, consider condensing that based off the work you're doing. If I were writing a manuscript, maybe the duration of my sprints are now only a week or 2 weeks based off of how much work I've gotten done. If I'm writing my dissertation, they probably should be a week, especially if that's kind of my main priority. So you can actually adjust the kind of time frame of what that sprint looks like, and then maybe modifying some of the pieces. If you're only having a sprint that's lasting a week, you probably don't need to give weekly updates. So instead, you can kind of just skip those and just have a sprint review, or maybe you meet with a PI or other lab member every week, just share what you've accomplished, share what you're planning to accomplish, and then if there's any feedback that they have on the writing or other things that you're working on, they're welcome to give it at that point. So I think overall, the beauty of this framework is that it can be applied in so many different ways. So what I would recommend is just thinking about the work that you want to do, thinking about the time frame in which you want to accomplish it, and then making some adjustments to that sprint time frame. So that's it for this video, walking you through the Scrum for Scientists framework. If you'd like to try out a sprint and see how it works for you and your research, I'd recommend 2 resources from our website. The first is the RSR Experimental Sprint Schedule. Essentially, using the 2-month duration of a sprint, I've mapped out over the course of a year sprint dates that you can kind of automatically use to kind of jump into a sprint. There's also even rest sprints incorporated into those to give you kind of a break every once in a while. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. And the other resource I would recommend is the RSR Key Elements of a Sprint Informational Guide and Template. You can check those out on my website, and I think they'll be really great ways to kind of start using this sprint methodology in your research. Also, if you're just interested in learning more about Scrum generally, I'll put a link in the description box to the book created by the authors of Scrum. where you can kind of read more about how they developed it and some of the different places that they've actually used Scrum methodology. And lastly, if you want to try incorporating sprint schedules into your academic research, leave a comment down below and just let me know how that goes for you and any of the things that you've tried and how you kind of like using this as a resource for you in your academic research. So that's all for now. Feel free to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and definitely check out our website, which is linked in the description box below if you'd like to learn more kind of tips and tricks about project management and academic research. Bye.